he turned to Russell. "What happened?" he asked. "Jad Jamal was working in the interpreter's locker room," Russell said, "on the day that the man in the mask climbed the fire escape." "Bring him to me," Tobin said. "We can't find him. He wasn't home yesterday, and he didn't come to work this morning." "Go back to his apartment," Tobin said angrily. "Doug's already there," Russell said. He was looking at the pictures on Tobin's desk. "Hey," he said, suddenly excited. "This guy lives with Jamal." He picked up a picture and read the name on the back. John Gamba, Gabon, Africa. Jean Gamba was in the Crown Heights apartment. He smoothed down his sharp suit and straightened his tie. He threw some papers on the floor, picked up a big bag, and left the room. Doug was sitting outside the apartment. He called Russell. "Jamal's friend left the building." Tobin took Russell's phone. "Stay with him," he said to Doug. He put down the phone and turned to Dot. "We're going to Crown Heights," he said. Tobin and Dot drove quickly through the city. They took out their guns and went slowly into Jamal's apartment. Dot opened the kitchen door. "In here," she called to Tobin. There were boxes, bottles, and a lot of black plastic on the kitchen table. The room was a bomb factory. Dot went into the bedroom, but it was empty. Then she saw that the closet door was open. She moved closer and found Jad Jamal's body. "Keller!" she shouted. He didn't reply, so she went back into the kitchen. "We have a dead body in the closet," she told him. "I'll call for help. It's very dark in here. How can you see?" She moved toward the light switch. "Wait!" Tobin cried, his eyes on the light above them. Her hand stopped, and she looked up. The light was covered with black plastic. It was another bomb. Slowly, Tobin and Dot moved out of the kitchen and down the stairs. At the same time, Doug was following Gamba. At the subway station, both men got on a train. Gamba held his bag on his knees. When the subway train stopped, Gamba got off. Doug waited for a second and then followed. They walked up the stairs onto the Brooklyn streets. Gamba walked to the bus stop and got in line. A few hundred meters away, Mohammed was watching Kuman's apartment. He saw the rebel leader leave his building and walk down the street with his guards. The African said hello to a neighbor and gave some money to a homeless prison. Suddenly, Mohammed saw Sylvia standing at a bus stop. Why was she there? He looked down the street and saw King's car. What was happening? Kuman walked toward the bus stop. He and his men stopped next to Sylvia. When the bus arrived, one of Kuman's men stepped in front of her. "There's a line," Sylvia said angrily in Ku. Kuman heard her and smiled. He followed her onto the bus. Mohammed ran to the bus and jumped on too. King picked up his radio and spoke urgently to Tobin. "She just got on the bus with Kuman." "What's she doing?" Tobin shouted. Sylvia found a seat and sat down, and Kuman sat across from her. His men looked nervously at them. "Did you speak Ku? My language from home?" "Yes," Sylvia replied. "I'm Matoban." He gave her the smile of a man who liked pretty women. Do you know who I am? He asked. Yes, you're a killer. You ordered the murder of a Jean Zola, Sylvia said angrily. The other men moved closer, but Kuman held up his hand. Who told you this? Kuman said. Where's my brother? Sylvia asked. Your brother? Kuman said. Who is your brother? I don't know who you are. You're very brave. Or crazy. You wanted a meeting with Zola. Your people called Philippe Brulette. You know him. I don't, Kuman said. So someone wants you to believe that I killed Zola. You are wrong. You should believe me, Miss Matoban. Why? Sylvia asked. Because I want to work with Zola. We cannot win alone, but we can win together. He has people who can fight. I have money. I wanted a meeting, but I didn't ask for one. If Zola is dead, that's bad news for everyone. The bus slowed and stopped. Jean Gamba climbed on, found a seat behind an old lady, and sat down. He opened his bag, took out a small lunchbox, and put it on the floor under his seat. Doug sat down a few seats behind Gamba. He saw Sylvia, but she didn't see him. He recognized Mohammed and turned away. Then he pulled out his phone and called Tobin. We have a problem, Doug said. Gamba and I just got on the 33 bus with Mohammed and Sylvia Broom and Kuman. You're all on the same bus, Tobin said in surprise. Yes. Suddenly, Tobin understood. The bomb factory. Gamba was on the bus with Kuman, and he had a bomb. You and Mohammed, get off, and get Miss Broom off too, now. We can't do that, Doug said. We're moving. Is Gamba carrying anything? Tobin asked. A bag. It's on his knee. Can you get to him? Tobin asked. No, he'll see us, Doug said. The bus slowed down. We're stopping. At the back of the bus, Kuman was still talking to Sylvia. What do you do here, so far from home? He asked. I work, and I hope, Sylvia replied. Like me, Kuman said. I don't think so, Sylvia said angrily. Where do you work? I'm an interpreter at the UN. The UN is full of words. They mean nothing, Kuman said. You want more war? Sylvia asked. I want more business, Kuman said. Countries aren't important now, only companies, international companies. I think you're wrong, Sylvia said. Kuman smiled. You're still young, he said. What's your brother's name? Simon Broom. You're very brave. I'll ask my people to find out about him. Thank you. Sylvia stood up and moved toward the door of the bus. She was shaking. King, in his car behind the bus, saw Sylvia climb down the steps. He used his radio to call Dot. Tobin was still talking on the phone to Doug. What's happening? He asked. We stopped, Doug said quietly into his cell phone. She's getting off. Gamba is too. Is he carrying the bag? Tobin asked. Doug couldn't answer because Gamba was looking straight at him. Then Gamba moved past Kuman and off the bus. He's off the bus, Doug said, but I think he recognized me. Mohammed stood up and followed Gamba. I've got him, he said quietly as he walked past Doug. Mohammed is off the bus, Doug told Tobin. He's following Gamba and King is watching Miss Broom. I'll stay with Cooman." Doug closed his cell phone. "Get off the bus now," Tobin shouted, but he was too late. An old woman opened the bus window and shouted, "Sir, excuse me, you forgot your lunch." She pointed at the lunchbox under the seat. Doug looked out the window and watched Gamba walk away. Suddenly, he knew. "Oh no," he thought. There was a terrible noise, then a ball of fire. In the street, Mohammed and Sylvia fell to the ground. Chapter 9. Sylvia's History. Tobin and Dot drove quickly across town to the burning bus. The air smelled of smoke and death. They saw bodies under sheets. The windows in King's car were broken, and a doctor was helping him. Mohammed was sitting on the sidewalk, and Dot walked toward him. There was no sign of Doug. Sylvia and a doctor were helping a small child. His mother lay unmoving on the ground. As Sylvia looked up, Tobin saw blood on her face and arms. She saw him, then turned back to the child. An hour later, Tobin took Sylvia home. For a long time she was silent. Then she spoke. "When I was a child, the driver on the school bus carried a gun. It scared me. That was 16,000 kilometers away. Now," she shook her head. Tobin stopped the car outside her apartment, and they both got out. Sylvia turned to him. "Thanks for bringing me home," she said. She opened the door to her building. "Why were you on the bus?" Tobin asked. "Can we talk later?" Sylvia said. "No," Tobin replied angrily. "I lost a man today. He was very young, only a kid. We're going to talk now." Sylvia tried to close the door, but he stopped her. He followed up the stairs into her apartment. "How do you know Cooman?" he asked. "I don't," Sylvia protested. "I never met him before." "You're lying to me again." "I'm not lying. I wanted him to help me." "With what?" Sylvia shook her head. "I can't tell you. Someone will get hurt." "Why did you leave Africa?" Tobin shouted. "I told you. Why did you come here?" "Stop shouting at me," Sylvia said. "Stop lying to me," Tobin said. "I was on a bus that was destroyed. I can't think while you're shouting." She sat down and put her head in her hands. Tobin took 2 pieces of paper from his jacket pocket and looked at them in front of Sylvia. There was a list of names on the first piece of paper, the names of people in an African rebel group called the AFP. The second piece of paper was a photo that showed Sylvia with a young white man. They were walking down the road in Africa with a number of black rebels, and they were all carrying rifles. Suddenly, the room was very quiet. "That isn't me," Sylvia said slowly. "Yes, it is." "It isn't me now." She stopped for a minute and then continued. "Thousands of people died in Matobo. First, we protested peacefully, and then we used rifles. We wanted people to listen, just listen. I killed a boy. He tried to kill me, so I shot him in the head. Then I gave that rifle," she pointed to the photo, "to my brother." "I can't do this," I told him, but my brother didn't listen. "Zuwani's still here," he said. "Our parents are dead, and he's alive. You can't stop." He never spoke to me again. I write to him, but he doesn't write to me. I send him notebooks. I hope he gets them. He doesn't want to know me. I lied to you, Sylvia continued, because I was afraid. I don't know if my brother is part of this plan. It's possible that he's trying to kill Zuwani. I don't know. I lied to everyone to get a job here. The UN can change Matobo. Words are slower and quieter than guns, but they're the only way to stop the killing. Tobin looked at the photo of young Sylvia carrying her rifle, and then he looked at the woman next to him. He went into the bathroom and found a washcloth. When he came back, he sat next to her. He carefully washed the blood from her face. She touched his hand and looked into his eyes. Slowly, she put her head on his shoulder. Tobin didn't move for a long time. Then he put his arms around her. He watched her fall asleep. In the Mataban government offices on the other side of town, Lud was watching the news on television. A reporter was talking about the bomb on the bus. There were two other men in the room, the ambassador's assistant, Matu, and the well-dressed African, John Gamba. The interpreter was on the bus, Gamba said. She was talking to Kuman. Is she? Lud asked. She got off the bus before the bomb. What were they talking about? Lud asked. I don't know, Gamba replied. What did Kuman tell her? Lud asked softly. Chapter 10, Simon's Notebooks. The next morning, there were a lot more protesters outside the UN building. Opposite them, the Matoban ambassador was speaking to a large crowd of reporters. Matu interpreted his words into English. This is why Dr. Zuwanie must speak, the ambassador said. The rebels are here in America, and they want to bring fear with the bombs. This terrible attack on the bus is an attack on the UN. Sylvia watched them for a few minutes and then turned away. Inside the UN, Tobin, Dot, Wu, and Rory were looking at pictures of Gian Gamba. We're searching everywhere for him, Tobin said. He won't get into the UN building, Wu said. Maybe he's already gone and it's finished, Rory said. But Wu and Tobin didn't believe him. Suddenly, Dot's cell phone rang. She listened, then turned to Tobin. 15 minutes later, Tobin and Dot hurried into the Chelsea Hotel and met Ostrov outside one of the rooms. Inside, a police officer was taking photos. There were cameras on the bed and a note and a bag on the desk. Tobin went into the bathroom where Philippe was lying in the bath. The water was cold and red with blood. Ostrov picked up the note on the desk and gave it to Tobin. It was addressed to Sylvia. Tobin put the note in his pocket and left the hotel. He and Dot didn't speak as they drove back to the UN. As Sylvia came down the stairs into the UN entrance hall, she saw Tobin near the door. He was carrying a small bag, and the look on his face meant bad news. Tobin took her outside, and they sat down together. Sylvia closed her eyes. Is it Philippe? She whispered. Tobin was silent, and she continued. You can tell me. Yes, Tobin said. He cut his wrists. Sylvia, I was unkind to him, Sylvia said sadly. He was unhappy, and I shouted at him. Did he leave a note? Yes, Tobin said. Did you read it? Sylvia asked. Of course you did. Tobin took the note out of his jacket pocket and handed it to her. She shook her head. Read it to me, she said. Dear Sylvia, Tobin read. I couldn't find the words, so I lied to you. Simon was at the stadium with Zola, and they shot him too. I was too scared to tell you. Simon was braver than me. You're braver than me. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Tobin looked up at Sylvia. He wrote, I'm so sorry twice? She asked quietly. No, Tobin said. Once. The second time was me. She smiled sadly. I don't know what to say, Tobin continued. My friends didn't know what to say to me after my wife's death. Now I know how they felt. It's okay, Sylvia whispered. Yes, Tobin said. I tell my friends it's okay too. He picked up the bag and put it between them. This was with the note. He stood up slowly and walked away. Sylvia opened the bag. There were more than 30 notebooks inside. Her brother's notebooks. She opened one of them. It was full of lists, in the writing of a child, lists of sports teams, science facts, and countries. She recognized one of the newer notebooks by its gray cover, a book that she sent him. Inside was a list of names, hundreds of names. Ruth Vera, killed in a bus station. Charles Token, shot. Thomas Vi, knifed to death. Robert Mamu, murdered in a police station. She remembered Kuman's words. Zuwani wants to stay in Matobo as president. People only have to think that someone is trying to kill him. That's enough to make him stronger. She remembered her parents and her sister and the soldiers that killed them. She heard her brother's voice at the time. Don't cry, Boy said. I'm here. I won't leave you, I promise. I'll look after you. She remembered her reply. I'll look after you too. Promise me, young Simon said. She opened another of the older notebooks. There was a list of animals, and then some names. Joel Broom, killed by Zuwani's soldiers. Mary Broom, killed by Zuwani's soldiers. Alexandra Broom, killed by Zuwani's soldiers. She picked up a pen and added another name to the list. Simon Broom, shot to death. She looked up at the sky. Her face was suddenly older and harder. I promise, she whispered, as she wrote another name in the notebook. Sylvia Broom, shot to death. Chapter 11. Death of a Killer later that night. While Russell was playing cards in the apartment across from Sylvia's home, Tobin looked at some photos. There were photos of Philippe, dead in the bathroom, and Jamal, dead in the closet. There were police photos of the African mask and the bomb factory kitchen. He looked closely at a list of telephone numbers on the kitchen wall and copied them onto a piece of paper. He read a police report. The hair in the mask was Jamal's. There were photos of the people from the Matabon ambassador's office. He looked at Philippe's pictures from Africa, a small town, Ajinasola, and Simon Broom walking into a stadium. The next photo showed a large black car and 3 soldiers. Then there was a picture of a well-dressed African man. He was climbing out of the car and walking toward the stadium. It was Gamba. Zola's dead, Tobin said quietly. Russell looked up from his card game. Did you say something? he asked. Tobin didn't reply. He moved to the window and looked at Sylvia's apartment. There was a black car outside the building and a man in Sylvia's living room. "There's somebody in there," he shouted to Russell. He ran to the door and down into the street. Gamba walked quietly through Sylvia's apartment. The living room was empty, so he went into the bedroom. The bathroom door was closed, but he could hear the shower. He shot 3 times through the door, then kicked it down. The shower was empty. Tobin ran into the room. Both men stopped, and then Tobin pointed his gun at Gamba's head. "Drop your gun and lie face down on the floor, now!" he shouted. Gamba said something in French and lifted up his gun. Tobin shot him. Then he ran into the bathroom and looked into the shower. Where was Sylvia? He turned to the window. It was open, and the street below was empty. Tobin called the police and his boss, J. Pettigrew. Russell joined them, and they stood in the street outside Sylvia's apartment. "Who is she?" Pettigrew asked. "Does somebody want to kill her? Or is she the killer?" "I don't know," Tobin said. "Well, where is she?" Pettigrew asked angrily. "Maybe you can ask her." "I don't know," Tobin said again. "She's scared, but that doesn't tell us anything. Russell, check these numbers." He gave Russell the list of telephone numbers from Jamal's kitchen wall. "What's happening, Tobin?" Pettigrew said. "I thought that 2 different men, Jamal and Philippe, were the killers, but they're both dead. Somebody wants us to ink it's one of them. It isn't." "What about Sylvia?" Pettigrew asked. "When something happens, she's always there. She was on the bus with Kuman." "I don't think she's a killer," Tobin said. "Then who are we looking for?" Pettigrew said. "Zuwani will hear tomorrow morning. We don't have much time." A police officer brought out Gamba's body. Niels Lud arrived at the same time and looked at the dead man's face. "Who is he?" he asked. "John Gamba," Tobin said. He looked closely at Niels Lud, but Lud's face was empty. "Our bomber," Tobin continued. "I shot him." "Where is the interpreter?" Lud asked. "She's gone. He missed her," Tobin said. "Can I look upstairs?" Lud asked. Tobin sent an agent upstairs with him. "Go home and get some sleep," Pettigrew said to Tobin. "I'm going to wait for her," Tobin protested. "No, you're not," Pettigrew said. "Russell and Dot can look at her. You need sleep. I want you to be awake tomorrow morning." He looked at his watch. "This morning, we have 7 hours." Dot drove him home. "Tobin," she said quietly, "I'm worried about you. They're not our family, and they're not our friends. They're our job. You told me that." Tobin looked out the car window. "I know," he said, "and it's true." "She'll be okay," Dot said. He left the car and went into his apartment. There was a message on the answering machine, and he turned it on. He heard Sylvia's voice and street noises behind it. "I'm fine, but I don't want to talk. Tobin, you were right. My brother was right. Words don't stop the killing. I've had enough. I'm going home." Chapter 12. The President Arrives. On Friday morning, there were hundreds of security officers around the UN building. There were police officers with guns on the roof and Coast Guard boats on the river. A large group of protesters stood outside the UN. Many of them wore face masks to protect their families in Matobo. Lewis called Tobin. The numbers on Jamal's wall. There's a pizza restaurant, a store, and an international cell phone. Find the cell phone, Tobin ordered. Who owns it? Then Muhammad called. Sylvia used a computer to get a flight, but I don't know where she's going. Get passenger lists for all flights to South Africa from JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark airports. Find her and put her on the phone. Lewis called him again. The international cell phone belonged to Jean Gamba, he said. Did he call somebody at 3:30 p.m. the day before yesterday? Tobin asked. Yes, Lewis replied. That was after the bomb on the bus, Tobin said. Who was the first person he called? Try the number, then call me back. A minute later, Tobin's cell phone rang again. It's a number in the Mataban government offices, Lewis said. Lud's number? asked Tobin. No, Lewis replied. Somebody named Marcus Matu. He's one of the ambassador's assistants. Go there, Tobin shouted. His phone rang again. This time it was Muhammad. She's on a flight out of JFK Airport at 9 a.m. Go to the airport and wait for her, Tobin said. Then call me. Matu and a group of Matabans arrived at the UN building. They walked through the security gates, past the UN guards, and past Tobin. Dot was at JFK Airport when Edmund Zuwani came down the stairs from his airplane. He looked old, small, and weak. Is that Zuwani? Dot asked the agent next to her. Has that old man really killed thousands of people? Lud greeted the president. Zuwani smiled and climbed into a car. Lud and Dot got in with him, and they started to drive across the city to the UN. Zuwani looked out the car window at Manhattan Island. I want to go to the theater, he said. That's not possible, sir, Dot said. Last time I came here, there was a lot of sky, the president said. Now there are more tall buildings. You came here 23 years ago, Dr. Zuwani, Lud said. Things change. They get less important, Zuwani said. They put flowers on the bridge during my last visit. I freed Matobo, and the American people welcomed me with flowers. A few minutes later, the car arrived at the UN building. The protesters shouted angrily and waved their signs at the president. He looked surprised. Are these people here for me? He asked Dot. Yes, Dot replied. Tobin opened the car door, and Zuwani climbed out slowly and took his arm and helped him into the building. Tobin's cell phone rang again. I'm at the airport. I can't see her, Muhammad said. Stay there, Tobin said. He turned to Pettigrew. Can we keep Zuwani in the safe room? It will give us more time. We can try, Pettigrew said, but he wants to speak. Tobin called Lewis and King. Are you at the Mataban government offices? He asked. Yes, Lewis replied, but Matu isn't here. He didn't come in this morning. Nobody knows where he is. They know where he is, King said, but they won't tell us. Get a photo of him and send it to the UN security officers, Tobin said, then go to his home address. 2 minutes later, a UN security officer came up behind him. "This picture just arrived, sir," he said, and he gave Tobin a photo of Matu. Tobin looked at it carefully and recognized the face. "He's here!" Tobin shouted. "I just saw him at the top of the stairs." He left Dot with Zuwani and ran into the main hall. It was full now, with hundreds of people who were waiting for Zuwani. Tobin saw Lud sitting with the other people from Matobo. He looked up and saw the interpreters in their booths. He looked for Matu, but he couldn't see him. Chapter 13. Murder in the UN. Marcus Matu went into the men's restroom and pulled the paper towel cover from the wall. Pieces of a rifle were hidden behind it. He put them in his bag and left the restroom. Then he ran upstairs to the interpreters' booths. One of the interpreters was sitting in a booth, testing his microphone. He didn't hear the door open behind him. Matu hit him on the back of the head, and the man fell to the floor. Matu opened his bag and took out the pieces of the rifle. He put them together quickly and looked through the window of the booth. President Zuwani was standing at the front of the hall. The Secretary General introduced him and made a short speech of welcome. Then Zuwani started to speak. "Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General," Zuwani said, "today rebels are attacking my country. They will do anything to hurt me. They even bombed a bus here in New York. How can I protect my country from enemies like this?" Tobin stood at the back of the room, watching. Lewis called him on his radio. "We're at Matu's address," Lewis said. "He's not here. And it's not an apartment. It's an AIDS hospital. This guy has nothing to live for." Tobin looked again around the hall and saw an empty seat. Niels Ludd was missing. He looked up at the interpreters' booths. There was a small hole in one of the windows. "Get Zuwani out of here!" he shouted to Dot and Rory. Then he started to run. Upstairs, Matu was on his knees on the floor of the booth. There was a hole in the glass window, and he was pointing the rifle at Zuwani. The door opened. Matu turned quickly and pulled the rifle back from the window. Niels Ludd was standing behind him. He was wearing cotton gloves, and he was holding something in his left hand. "You did well," he said. "Your mother and sister will get the check for the money on Monday." Matu turned back to the window and pointed the rifle at Zuwani again. Ludd put his right hand inside his jacket pocket and took out a small gun. "But I don't want you to do too well," he said. Matu tried to shoot, but nothing happened. There was something wrong with the rifle. He pulled it back from the window and looked at Ludd. Ludd smiled. Then he shot Matu twice through the head. The second shot broke the window of the interpreter's booth into 1,000,000 pieces. Glass fell onto the people in the hall below. Some of them screamed and started to run for the exit doors. Dot and Rory were already pushing Zuwani out of the hall and into the safe room. With his gun in his hand, Tobin ran upstairs and into the interpreter's booth. He saw the male interpreter lying on the floor and the blood on Matu's face. Then he saw Lud. Lud was holding a small gun in his right hand. Matu's rifle was on the floor near his left hand. "I looked up and saw him," Lud said quickly. "Luckily, I was able to stop him. He's from our office." "I know who he is," Tobin said. "You can put your gun away now." Lud put his gun into his pocket. "He almost killed Dr. Zuwani," Lud said. "Another 2 or 3 seconds. I was almost too late." Tobin looked at him and remembered Kuman's words. "Zuwani wants to stay in Matobo as president. People only have to think that someone is trying to kill him. That's enough to make him stronger." Suddenly, he understood. He moved toward the rifle and started to pick it up. "Don't touch the rifle," Lud shouted. "Why?" asked Tobin. "Because I'm not wearing gloves? It's warm today. Why are you wearing gloves?" "What? I... Lud couldn't answer. "When the rifle didn't work," Tobin said, "Matu was probably very surprised. Did you have time to put the piece back in?" He pointed the rifle and Lud jumped back. "Yes," Tobin said. "I guess you did. But you were wearing gloves, so nobody will know. Only Matu's fingerprints are on that gun." The door opened and 2 UN security officers came in. Lud reached into his pocket for his gun, but Tobin and the officers were quicker. Dot ran into the room. "Nobody is going to shoot Zuwani," Tobin told her. "It was a smart plant. People will listen to a man in danger. They'll understand why he has to kill." He turned to Lud. "Are you the bad guy, Lud? Or are you working for a bigger bad guy?" He and Dot left the room. "Are you okay?" Dot asked. "Where's Zuwani?" Tobin asked. "In the safe room. What happened in there?" Tobin started to answer, but his cell phone rang. It was Mohammed. "I've checked every flight and every hotel in New York. I've asked her friends. Nobody knows her very well. They don't know where she is." "I know her," Tobin said slowly. "She said, 'I'm going home.'" "Where is home?" Dot asked. "Here," Tobin said. Chapter 14. Sylvia and the President Zuwani was alone in the safe room when the door opened. Sylvia walked in, carrying a bag. "Dr. Zuwani," she said. "Yes," he replied and smiled at her. "I remember your last visit to the UN," Sylvia said. "That was a long time ago," Zuwani said. "You were very young. I was very young. We watched you on TV, back home in Matobo. My family, all the families, watched you. You were like a movie star." Zuwani laughed. "I don't think so." "You were," Sylvia said. "We were excited and very proud of you because you were speaking to the world. But that was a long time ago." Her voice grew harder. "What is your name, child?" Zuwani asked. "Sylvia. You killed my family." Zuwani suddenly looked uncomfortable. His eyes moved around the room. "Where is everyone?" "We're alone," Sylvia said. She moved very quickly toward him and took a gun out of his pocket. "You always carry this gun. I saw it in every picture, everywhere you went. You saved our country with this gun." She held the gun in her hand, but she didn't point it at Zuwani. "Then you used it to kill your people." She pulled a small book out of her bag. It was Zuwani's life story. She opened it and read, "You must fight for your land and country before you can understand the importance of that land and country." Who said that? Zuwani looked closely at her face, but he didn't speak. "Yes, you did," Sylvia said. "I was 11 years old and I loved you. You were my teacher." She turned the page and showed Zuwani a photo of a little boy. "Look at yourself," she said. "The good times are past," Zuwani said. "Finished." "It's not finished," Sylvia shouted. "Not until you die." "But I'm not ready to die." Sylvia pulled a notebook out of her bag. "These people weren't ready to die," she screamed. "You were a good man, and now you gave your people so much, and then you took it away." She moved toward him and placed the gun against his head. Tobin and Dot met Chief Wu, Rory, and some UN security guards at the safe room door. "Is he in there?" Tobin asked. "Yes," Wu replied. "What's happening?" "Keep everyone out," Tobin said to Dot. "Give me a few minutes." He stood near the door and called, "Sylvia, I'm coming in. It's really me. I'm coming in now." He opened the door slowly and looked inside the room. Sylvia was pointing the gun at Zuwani's head. Tobin saw Simon's notebook on the table in front of the president. "Close the door," Sylvia said. Tobin looked back at Dot, Rory, and Wu. "It's okay," he said to them, and went inside the room. He closed the door and turned to Sylvia. "Don't do this. We have Niels Lud and the rifle. That's all we need." "But I have him," Sylvia said, and pointed at Zuwani. "Sylvia," Tobin said softly, "he's finished. Lud is too. Zuwani will die in prison. Simon didn't die in prison. He was shot. I want him to die the same way. He will die in 10 seconds, but you'll remember killing him at the rest of your life." He turned to Zuwani. "Matu is dead. Your head of security has told us everything. That leaves you." Zuwani opened his mouth to speak, but Tobin stopped him. "It was a good plan," he said. "You're almost murdered and people understand you better. But now it's finished. You'll go to court." Sylvia pressed the gun harder against Zuwani's head. "No, he won't," she said. "Sylvia, listen," Tobin said. "Remember the story about the coup? The family can watch a murderer die, or they can save him. I hate the man who destroyed my life, but I don't want to kill him." "Then you're wrong," Sylvia said. "No, I'm not," Tobin said. "I don't want to be sad for the rest of my life." Zuwani picked up Simon's notebook. "What's this?" he asked. They weren't listening to him, and he started reading the names in the book. "Leave this room now," Sylvia ordered Tobin. "I can't," Tobin said. "Put the gun down." "I can't," Sylvia said. "You can." "Just go," she shouted. Tobin quickly pulled out his gun and pointed it at her. Then he slowly placed it on the table. "See? It's easy to put down a gun." She looked at him, but she didn't move. "Shoot him, and he'll be dead," Tobin said. "And then you'll be dead. And I'll be dead too." Sylvia's hand was shaking. Suddenly, she looked at Zuwani and pointed at the book on the table. "Read it," she shouted. Zuwani put down the notebook and picked up his life story. Where? Which part? The first page, Sylvia said. Slowly and quietly, Zuwani started to read. The guns around us. Louder, Sylvia said. Like when you wrote it, when you believed in it, when it meant something. Zuwani tried again. The guns around us make it hard to hear, but a man's voice is different from other sounds. We can hear it over all other noises. We can hear a whisper above the noise of 1,000 soldiers. When? When? Sylvia shouted. When it is telling the truth, Zuwani read. He looked at the picture of himself when he was small boy. Then he picked up Simon's notebook again, and his hand moved slowly across the names of the dead. That little boy was my country, Sylvia said. Tobin reached out his hand toward her. She looked at him for a long time, and then she looked at Zuwani. Slowly, she gave the gun to Tobin, and he put it in his pocket. Chapter 15. The Names of the Dead. The main hall of the UN was full of people again. The interpreters were in their booths. Dr. Zuwani, the president of Matobo, will continue his speech, the UN Secretary-General said. Zuwani and Sylvia walked to the front of the silent room. Zuwani looked at the people in front of him. Then he started to speak in Ku. Sylvia interpreted his words into English. Nukwe Wabamcha. Temsha Wabamcha, killed by bombs. Bukewechu We Lali. Alexander Mungoshi, shot by soldiers. Stambuli Watiku, Ruth Kufomo, killed for crimes against Matobo. Tobin stood at the back of the hall and listened. Zuwani continued. Edgar Saku, Avuwa Mufusani. Killed in their home by a bomb, Sylvia interpreted. There were microphones inside the hall, so the protesters outside the building could hear Zuwani's words. He's reading a list of the names of the dead, one protester whispered. He's saying that he murdered them. Inside, too, people were beginning to understand. Zimwe Wangwama, Dukura Wamboko, holding a newborn child, Zuwani said in Ku. I don't know its name. And then, in English, I'm sorry. He looked at Sylvia. He read the names for a long time. Finally, he said, Simon Broom, and Sylvia repeated, in English, shot to death. 2 days later, the sun was shining on New York. Tobin was outside the UN building, watching the river. Sylvia came out and walked over to him. Hi, she said. Tobin turned around. Hi, he said. What happened? It was okay, she replied. They told me what you said. You don't think I'm dangerous. Yes, Tobin said. I lied. They both smiled. Thank you, Sylvia said. Are you at work again? Tobin asked. No, Sylvia said. They didn't believe you. I'm going home. Home? To Africa? Yes, Sylvia said quietly. I miss it. I never had the time to tell you. I missed the animals at night, the rain, the smells. We've got rain here and smells, Tobin said, and pointed at the river. There's nobody there for you in Africa, is there? No, she said. But I can remember them there. You can remember people anywhere, Tobin said. Sylvia understood that he was thinking about his wife. She touched his arm. My job has changed, he continued. Who am I protecting? I need to know. Maybe I need a change. Have you visited Africa? Tobin laughed. I was born in New York, and I went to school on the same street. Then I came across the river to Manhattan. It's not far. You're a traveler, Sylvia smiled. I've known you for 5 or 6 days. It feels much longer. When are you leaving? Tobin asked. Tomorrow, Sylvia said. Will you be safe? Is there another Zuwani in Matobo? No, that can't happen. We won't let it. Tobin smiled at her. You're already there, aren't you? He said softly. Then he pointed at the water. Hey, look, we're on the same side of the river now. Will you be okay? Sylvia asked. Will you tell me? She turned to leave, but he stopped her. He pulled her close and kissed her. Then she moved away. You'll always know, Tobin said. Sylvia walked a few steps away from him and then stopped again. What was her name? Your wife? She asked. Lori Keller, Tobin said. Killed in a car accident in Santa Fe, 23 days ago. Sylvia smiled sadly at him and said a few words in Koo. Tobin guessed the meaning. Rest in peace, he said. Sylvia walked away toward the UN gates. She didn't look at him again, but she was still smiling. Tobin looked back at the calm, wide river and across it toward Africa.